A key insight in as we learn about techniques is something called the marshmallow test that some of you may have heard of. So the marshmallow test was operated out of Stanford, and I forget how long it went, like multi years. And the marshmallow test essentially is this. A child is brought by somebody in a cloak or kind of like dressed up in a smock or something like that, put it at a table and said, here's a marshmallow. I'm going to go away and be back in 5 minutes. If the marshmallow is still there, I will give you another marshmallow. If you eat the marshmallow while I'm away, that's it. You won't get another marshmallow. So they studied this with like many children. And they found, yes, indeed, there were some children that ate the mushroom or marshmallow and some children that didn't. And then they actually studied that after this test, the ones that postponed eating the marshmallow and got 2 had this propensity for delayed gratification. And they achieved so much better in life than the kids who did not embrace delayed gratification. Now, since then, the marshmallow test has been criticized, saying a lot depends on whether the child actually trusts authority figures or not, which often can be a privileged background and things like that. So legitimately, that aspect of the marshmallow test has been called into question. But there's one aspect of the marshmallow test I want to focus on that has not been called into question. So they noticed with the kids that actually embraced delayed gratification and waited to have 2 marshmallows rather than 1, is they didn't just stare down the marshmallow like this child here. They actually embraced certain techniques. So for example, some kids would close their eyes and tell themselves a story. Other kids would look at the wall and count the bricks. Other kids would look out the window. And what they found is these techniques could then be taught to other kids who had not delayed eating the marshmallow, and then they were empowered to delay eating the marshmallow. And to me, the key lesson here is getting better at this stuff is not about will, where you just like force yourself. The key we're finding is to get better at this stuff, you have to embrace very specific techniques that actually make it easier for you to get better at this. So that's one key insight in our technique journey. This isn't just about trying harder. It's about trying smarter. And this next slide is probably more therapy for me than you. So I apologize, but I do want to get this out of my system. This is Howard Rafa. And back in the day, and when I say back in the day, I mean when classrooms look like this, Howard Rafa would teach effective decision making. And he taught at Columbia. And he was so good at teaching how to make effective decisions, the big leagues, Harvard came calling, and they said, please, we would like you to join us. He was so good at his job that when Columbia University heard about this, they said, Howard, please stay. And if you stay, we'll double your salary. So it's like, oh, the big leagues, double my salary. What do I do? He actually speaks to a professor colleague he has and goes, I'm really stumped with what to do here. This is a dilemma. And his colleague goes, well, Howard, the reason these 2 universities want you so badly is because you're really good at teaching people how to make decisions. Use those techniques and make the decision yourself. And he literally responded with this. You don't understand. This is a serious decision. And what I'm finding is increasingly as people try to teach effective techniques and decision making and describe it however you want, like entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, innovation, how to experiment, things like that. The people that seem to be portrayed as experts are not using those techniques themselves. So this is a warning to you to be on the lookout for the Howard Rafas of the world. If you sense someone is teaching you this stuff and they're not actually embracing the principles they're teaching you, stay away. That's a red flag, danger sign. I can absolutely assure you the stuff we're teaching you right today, I use with my board. We use it as a team at Trico, and I've found, again, it's changed my life. They're like fantastic tools. Okay, so let's get back to our journey of figuring out what techniques we can use to kind of master our mindsets. Now, most of you may have heard the phrase more art than science. Now, obviously that phrase implies that with science, if you do certain things, you're guaranteed certain results. But art, you can do certain things, but you're not guaranteed results. So for example, when it comes to art, I can't draw, and I can't imagine anybody teaching me to get better at drawing. It's just like not going to happen. There's a woman by the name of Betty Edwards who says that's poppycock. She says, take anybody and give her a week with them, and she can teach them to be an artist and draw like an artist. And here are actually some samples of her work. So what she does is she has somebody draw a self-portrait just before they start her class, and then a self-portrait a week after, and you can kind of see the change. So that's like sample one. Here's another sample, and again, just note the incredible kind of differences. And then like here's a third sample. And these aren't even like the best examples. There were some I couldn't actually put into PowerPoint where they're like probably closer to what I would have drawn. And just the difference is absolutely remarkable. Well, why am I talking to you about this? I'm talking to you about this because there's some key insights in our technique exploration that Betty can offer us. Number one, she says, the key to master anything is to break it down into its learnable components. So that's insight number one, is for looking at mastering techniques, break things down into their learnable components. Number two, when it comes to drawing, she has this really interesting observation. And she says, drawing is less about drawing than observing. So she trains people not necessarily to draw, she teaches people to see. She teaches people to see edges and shapes and shadows. And it's doing that. And remember Ann Mei Chang, who said the challenge with trying to be better at learning is we're better at focusing on doing. This seems to me a perfect metaphor for the kind of world of training to be better change makers. Is we've been focusing too much on doing. We should be focusing on training you how to actually see. So that's another kind of key insight, and I think a perfect metaphor for a lot of what kind of plagues this kind of space in helping kind of develop these techniques. Another book that kind of provides a similar insight, and again, unfortunately, it's sports, is this amazing book called Peak: How to Master Anything. And again, it focuses on golf, and I'm sorry for, again, doing a sports analogy, but I think it can apply to other things. Anders Ericsson's great insight in Peak echoes what Betty is saying, which is things have to be broken down into their learnable components. So I don't know how much you know about golf. I don't golf. Probably the last person to explain to you what golf is. But there's really three phases to golf. There's your tee off, then there's the fairway, which is like the shorter grass, and then there's like sand pits and traps and forests and stuff like that. And then there's like the putting green. So let's say you want to get better at golf. Anders says you have to, if your overall purpose, i.e. your why, is to improve your score by 5, he says that's too general. You need to break it down into more specifics. So how would you improve your score by 5? Maybe it's by increasing the amount of drives landing on the fairway. So that's like tee offs. But he says that's progress, but keep going, get even like more specific. So you go, how do I increase my drives landing on the fairway? By reducing the tendency to hook your ball when you do your initial swing. And that's progress, but he says get even more specific. He says, get an instructor who will give you the specific advice to change your swing in specific ways so you stop hooking the ball. What's interesting about this is notice if our why was to improve our score by 5, and imagine if this was like anything where you're trying to improve. There's so many factors that can influence whether you improved your score by 5 in a given game. So for example, let's say it was sunny out, it was less windy, the grass was wet, so it was more slick and the ball traveled faster. There'd be all these explanations for you improving your score by 5 that ultimately wouldn't help you. It's having the discipline to break it down into its learnable components and say, this is a specific thing that I can control. This is a specific thing that I know if I'm doing well or not right away. I can tell right away whether I'm doing a specific swing. So again, it confirms that when it comes to techniques, we have to get the learnable components and continue to break them down. So we go from more general, which has lots of explanations, to very specific, which has only one explanation, and it's an explanation that's completely within your control. So with that, we're going to propose to you, there's 3 key mindset techniques. And again, I can't say for sure these are getting down to golf swing, although we have the golf swing kind of logo there to remind us that we're always trying to find our golf swing to improve our score. 1 is getting close to golf swing, and 2, they should empower you to find your golf swing in whatever journey you're particularly on. 1 is called mental model check-in. 2 is spare and spur your ingenuity. And 3 is get different viewpoints. So there's just 3 key mindset techniques you need to focus on. Mental model check-in, spare and spur your ingenuity, get different viewpoints. I'm going to talk about each one. So mental model check-in. Recognizing the power and peril of mental models is step 1. And step 2 is beware of your cognitive biases. And again, this is where we're starting to get more detailed. So there's a very big chance that you'll get into brain overload. Do not kind of connect all the dots. Try to take it individually as whether each individually makes sense. And then after we go through the workshop, you'll see the workbook actually now starts connecting them all together. So let's talk about recognizing the power and peril of mental models. But first, a story about numbers. This is not the last group of students I spoke to. This is actually a student or a bunch of individuals that are engaged in something called the International Memory Game. Doesn't it look like fun? The essence of the International Memory Game is a number is mentioned at random, 1 every second, and whoever can repeat back the most numbers wins the memory game. So what Peak, the book How to Master Almost Anything, decided is they were going to work with a student to see how good they could get at the memory game to see what they could learn about learning. So when they had the student start seeing how good they can get, around that time, the record was like 15 numbers. So again, imagine a number mentioned randomly, 1 every second, 15 of them, where someone could repeat back those 15. As they focused on these techniques, they got the student to get up to 82 numbers. So that's student hearing 82 random numbers, 1 every second, and then the student could actually repeat them back. Now that sounds like a big number, but I want you to actually look at it, and it's on the screen now. That's 82 numbers repeated randomly and then repeated back, or mentioned randomly and then repeated back. Can you imagine being able to actually do that? The interesting thing is, as they started looking at the techniques for the memory game, even though the student got up to 82, by the time Peak, the book, was published, the world record was 300. And I did a class about 1.5 years ago when I looked at online for an update as to what the world record was. The world record was 456. So could you imagine more than 5 times the many numbers on your screen being mentioned randomly, 1 every second, and some human being being able to repeat them back? It's just extraordinary. Now, why am I telling you this? The reason I'm telling you this is it turns out the memory game is not about memory. The memory game is about mental models. And I'm going to kind of explain that a bit more. So that's recognizing the power and peril of mental models. So the power of mental models. The key to winning the memory game was using mental models, which is organizing the information that's coming in, the inputs of information in certain ways. So for example, the student that Peak worked with was a runner. So because they were a runner, they were used to numbers in 4s. So they always organized the numbers they heard in 4. And if they recognized any that they used frequently in their running, that was their technique. The person that got to 300 used a different technique. They actually memorized a word for each 2 numbers. And then when they heard them, they would create a sentence in their mind that memorized the word. I'm not saying this is easy. I'm just saying this is possible and a sign of what you can do with mental models. Now, the power of mental models is twofold. One, because it enables you to organize information as it comes into your brain, it stops your brain from being overloaded. And a classic example is, again, the memory game. The second great thing about mental models is because they organize the information that's coming in so your brain's not overloaded, you can now recognize patterns and cause and effect relationships. And it's those 2 things together that you can achieve by the mental models you use that leads to kind of great things such as memorizing more numbers and being able to repeat them back. In fact, the great insight of the Peak book is this, which is the superior organization of information, i.e. mental models, how you choose to organize information, is a theme that appears over and over again in the study of expert performers. So it's not necessarily that the experts knew more information, they were better at organizing the information they had. And you may go, well, okay, what's the difference between knowledge leading to being an expert versus mental models? The difference is experts use mental models to organize the information. It's again the same with the memory challenge, but imagine if you had lots of clothes. Even though you have lots of clothes, which in this metaphor would be bits of information, if they're disorganized, it's harder for you to access them. But if they're organized, such as you have a sock drawer, you have shirts in one area, or let's say summer clothes, the more you're organizing the information that's coming to you, the better you can tap into it when you need it. So for example, they found expert surgeons. They were always organizing information of saying, okay, here's the circumstances I'm given with this patient. Here's the possible things. Here's the clues for those things. I test them and I keep narrowing the odds. So again, it's the power to organize information based on your mental models. And what I want you to keep an eye on is as you go through your journey and catalyze, a key sign of whether you're making progress in a good way or not is, are your mental models becoming more and more sophisticated for like whatever you're doing? Because again, if you fully tap into the power of mental models, you can do the social impact equivalent of moving from memorizing and repeating back 15 numbers to 456. The way you use mental models is the secret to unlocking the kind of key impact you want. And that's the power of mental models. Another power of mental models is they're ubiquitous. So John Sterman says, every decision you make, everything you know, and everything you do is on the basis of models of one sort or another. You never have the choice of whether to model or not. It's a question of which model. Believe it or not, everything you do is the result of mental models. How you understand the words I'm saying right now, you're using mental models. How you're using a computer, mental models. How you walked to get into your chair, mental models. Mental models are everywhere and you're always using them. That's why they're so powerful. The third reason they're so powerful is mental models can actually influence what you see. So as Albert Einstein says, it's the theory, aka the mental model, which decides what you can observe. And if you don't believe me, there's something called like the gorilla challenge, where you're asked to watch a bunch of people bouncing balls and passing them and count the passing. There's a person in a gorilla suit that walks onto stage and will wave to you and then walks off stage. Most people, because they're so focused on the passing of the balls, i.e. their theory is that passing of the balls is the important thing and thing to observe, they don't even notice a person in a gorilla suit walking into the middle of the stage and waving hi. So believe it or not, your theory of how the world works, your mental models, are going to determine what you observe or not. That is the power of mental models. Now, they're not only powerful in choosing what you see, and also everything you're doing is mental models. Again, if used correctly, you can accomplish great things a la the number game. That is the power of mental models and why you should always be aware of them. But there's a peril, and the peril is this. Mental models leave things out. That is what they are to do by design, because mental models stop your brain from getting overwhelmed. So they're always going to leave stuff out. They may work very well. In fact, they may work fantastically, but even the ones that work the best are still leaving things out specifically so your brain doesn't get overwhelmed. So mental models are not reality. They're a view of reality. And always remembering that is crucial. And that leads me to the second danger of mental models, is they're so powerful and we use them so much, we forget we're using them. So it's very important to kind of always remember, no matter how right you think you are, the technique of checking into your mental models, recognizing you have them, and not forgetting them, and not forgetting they leave things out. So again, as good as the picture you have works for you, you're deliberately leaving things out, which means there's more information out there. You just have a piece of the truth, not the whole truth. So we were really intrigued by the power of mental models. So we actually had one of our colleagues do a report on talking to student change makers about the mental models they used, and particularly their blind spots. And one student eventually said, because we would ask each student about do you have blind spots? And the student said, well, no, I don't, because the fact that I'm aware of them means they're not blind spots anymore. And what's really intriguing about that comment is it kind of makes intuitive sense, but it actually isn't true. And the proof that it isn't true is what you're seeing right now, which is known as the lines illusion. So the way our brain works, because of the ends of both lines, we think the top line is smaller than the bottom line, but they're actually the same length. And again, it's known as the line illusion. And what this is it's an optical illusion where our eyes are tricking us and thinking a certain way, and it's wrong. The solution to this is you're never going to stop seeing the top line as being shorter. The solution to this is training yourself to realize that when you encounter the lines illusion, that it is in fact an illusion. And that's the key way out of blind spots. It's training our mind to recognize when they do them, when in Dan O'Reilly's way, we're predictably irrational. As long as we're aware of when we're predictably irrational, we can tell our brain not to do it. So this is a visual illusion. There's also illusions of how we think, where we think we're thinking the right way, but we're actually thinking the wrong way, because again, it's an illusion, and they're known as cognitive biases. And that leads us to our second mental model check-in is once you've become aware of your mental models, always be aware of your cognitive biases. You have cognitive biases. And again, what they are is thought patterns that are wrong, that will lead you down the wrong path, that are actually mistakes. Now, some of you may have heard this phrase cognitive bias before, or some of you may have been introduced to it just now. Just take a second to think, how many cognitive biases do you think you have? Humans actually have this many, 188. So this is like definitely overwhelming. So what we've done in the workbook is identified 9 of the most powerful cognitive biases for you. I'm going to focus on 2. As I mentioned, they're in the workbook. What I'd recommend you use the workbook for is if you're about to get to something where how you think about it is important, you could read the 9 cognitive biases to make you aware of them so that you may not fall into those traps. That's one way to use the workbook. Another way to use the workbook is when results aren't accomplishing what you want them to do, you can look to the workbook and see if maybe you're falling into a trap of a cognitive bias, and that's what's explaining why things are not going the way you would want them to. So here are just 2 kind of quick examples. One is known as the framing effect, cognitive bias. And what that is essentially suggests that we can frame the same information in different ways, and it creates very different reactions in people. So for example, if most people heard the odds of surviving surgery was 90%, they would feel good. But if they heard the chance of dying from surgery is 10%, they would feel bad. It's exactly the same information, just presented in different ways. Another example is for fat-free food. If I said to you food was 90% fat-free, you would have one reaction. But if I said to you it was 10% fat, you'd probably have a different reaction. And again, it's just how things are framed. So again, if things aren't going the way you want, see if you're a victim of something being just framed in a certain way that's nudging you in a certain direction. This next one may be like the biggest cognitive bias danger of all, and it's known as hindsight bias. And again, this is a mouthful, but I wanted you to have it. It says, your inability to reconstruct your past beliefs assumptions causes you to underestimate the extent to which you are surprised by events. Basically, what that is saying is, because you don't remember all the assumptions you made initially in your beliefs, you're not surprised by what actually happens. And this has like a number of dangers. Because you forget your initial assumptions, beliefs, you have a tendency not to learn, because how can you learn if you are not surprised by things that happen? On a related point, what this leads to, forgetting your initial beliefs, assumptions, goes, oh yeah, I thought that would happen. So it leads to an overconfidence. The third thing and danger is because you forget your initial beliefs, assumptions, there's a tendency if something works, you think, oh yeah, it was a good process. You judge things by the results, not by the process, which can be very dangerous, especially when it comes to change making work. The key thing when it comes to change making is not producing good results. It's producing a process where you can predict that you'll always replicate those results.